Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Warren Hoge, IPI's Senior Advisor for External Relations, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this policy forum on the human rights crisis in Syria, featuring Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro, Chairperson of the UN Human Rights Council's Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria 2011-2012, and the two other Commission members, Akin Ertürk and Koning AbuZayd. All three were appointed to the Commission in September 2011, and a resolution is now being considered in Geneva that would extend the Commission's life until this coming September, at which time a final report would be published with an oral update due first this June. A report of the Commission last month drew enormous attention because it concluded that Syrian government forces had, quote, committed widespread, systematic, and gross human rights violations amounting to crimes against humanity. The 72-page report said that anti-government forces had also committed abuses, but in nowhere near the scale and organization with those carried out by the state. At today's meeting, the three commissioners will amplify on that report and take your questions and comments on their findings and also on how they assembled credible information despite the government's refusal to let them into the country. Our subject could hardly be more topical. After days of negotiation, this morning, the Security Council has adopted a presidential statement expressing the Council's support for the mission of Kofi Annan, the Joint Special Representative on Syria for the United Nations and the Arab League. In Syria, fighting has flared again today in the suburbs of Damascus that the government thought to be securely in its control, with defectors shooting or lobbing grenades and government forces retaliating, a pattern developing across Syria as the uprising takes on more and more of the character of an insurgency. And Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, speaking in Jakarta today, welcomed the Security Council action, but reiterated that the now year-old rebellion in Syria still had, quote, potentially massive repercussions for the region and for the world. You have the full biographies of our three speakers in your program notes, so I will introduce them just very briefly now. Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro is Research Coordinator at the Center for the Study of Violence and retired Professor of Political Science at the University of São Paulo. He has taught at a number of universities in Europe and the United States and held high-ranking human rights positions both for the UN and for the Brazilian government. Akin Ertürk is a former faculty member at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara and has worked for various national and international agencies on rural development and women in development projects. And Koning AbuZayd is a former UN Undersecretary General with extensive experience in the Middle East and particularly in the Palestinian territories and with Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. She worked for 19 years, many of them in Africa, for the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Paulo, I'm very grateful to you for agreeing to hold this meeting here at IPI, and if I can add a personal note, for allowing me the chance to resume a friendship with you that began decades ago during the 5 years I spent as the New York Times correspondent based in Rio de Janeiro. Commissioners, welcome to IPI, and Paulo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Warren. We are very happy. I'm very happy to be here. And as you mentioned this Brazilian connection, I was thinking of those years of the 80s, and I was telling Warren that in 1987 we published with Human Rights Watch and Joanna Weschler, that is there, the first report ever on police abuse after 21 years of dictatorship in Brazil. I think this can be very inspirational in terms of how transition processes are long and difficult process. And I think that this is very appropriate for the Syrian situation. What complicated my life, because I was intending to have as a grand finale of my short introduction the joy of this presidential statement about Syria. But then I will. But he left me some space to review why we are so happy that this has finally been published and agreed in the Security Council. We have, as Warren mentioned, our division of labor is that I will give a general idea of our work of the two reports and main findings and conclusions. And my dear colleagues, Karen will deal with humanitarian. She's a great expert on this, and it's so great that we are together in this commission. And then Akin, that has also an enormous experience in terms of accountability, has 7 years as special rapporteur on violence against women. It was a outstanding work in the UN. She will speak about accountability and something that there are a lot of questions about our methodology of work. Then you know that these commissions of inquiry are becoming a sort of mechanism in the Human Rights Council. This is not a new thing, because the Security Council during the last 20 years has had many commissions of inquiry. But in the Commission on Human Rights and the Human Rights Council is something new, but with a lot of precedent. What is the main difficulty of our Commission of Inquiry? We have to deal with our ongoing situation. Because most of the past commissions on Côte d'Ivoire, on Guinea-Conakry, the Goldstone Commission on Libya, and two where I have participated on Togo and Timor-Leste, are ex-post examinations of the situation. We have a point of contact with Darfur, but at Darfur, they were allowed to come to the country, and we have not yet been allowed to come to Syria, but I will repeat our mantra: the fact that we have had not access to the country does not mean that we have not access to information in the country or from the country. I'd like also to add that with us is Dimitar Shalev, who is the director of our team. That, in fact, is our team that has prepared everything. A wonderful group of investigators and military experts and legal advisors that the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights that has developed incredible expertise on Commission of Inquiry has provided for our work. Then we have been appointed in September. We had this team assembled in Geneva. How we'll have reach the information? Of course, something that Akin will elaborate. Everything that are in this two reports are first-hand. Of course, we have a great admiration for all the reports that our fellow travelers, Human Rights Watch and Jan Levin, that is here, who is here also, have published in Syria. Of course, we are in contact with many NGO organizations or other research organizations, but everything that are in the reports are has been obtained by our own investigators. The first report, we decided to define the framework of our analysis. That is, we discussed the international human rights law and international criminal law, and we began to describe the types of gross human rights violations, not only theoretically, but with concrete examples, and I think that was very important. We are able to identify patterns of gross human rights violations. Of course, we had some recommendations, very concise, because we are not fans of cascades of recommendations common in many reports in the Human Rights Council. The second report, now that is when we began to prepare the second report, we know much better than what we are able to know during the preparation of the first report. We are able to present, for instance, a good description of the Syrian armed forces. I think that we managed to provide a good description of the chain of command. We have demonstrated that the chain in command is practically untouched since March 2011. Very few defections. Why so few defections? Perhaps from fear of retaliation for the families, but also for loyalty. And it's amazing. That is, the danger with Syria is that during all this year, a lot of people are looking towards Syria and thinking about Libya. But Libya, the armed force in Libya, I don't know if you have seen this film. The armed force in Libya is a sort of Armata Brancaleone, that ragtag of combatants, and it was not a force of around 300,000 men and women in arms with good equipment, not very modern, but with the good anti-aircraft weapons, something that in Libya was extremely shaky and weak. Then I think that to discuss situation in Libya is good to have very concrete, realistic assessments of the armed forces, and also of the security force and the militia, the Shabir, that are articulated, very good articulation. And we're able to describe the configurations of the operations, the repetitive configuration of operations in all this, in many of the cities. Then I think that we are able to share a good assessment of the Syrian Free Army, and also to give a very realistic assessment, because in fact the Syrian Free Army is something without not a clear chain of command. Each month you have a commander. You don't. Today I don't know really who is in command, because they are always fighting. We have all these assessments in the reports are with a great respect for all those people that are fighting in the arrests in Syria. That is, but. We need, I think that's important not to have illusions about the capability of the Syrian Free Army or the armed groups. The armed groups are not armed groups. They are citizens who are armed, many times to protect their neighborhoods. They are not coordinated. There is not a coordination among armed groups all over Syria. This doesn't exist. And sometimes I find very adorable when the government says that these armed groups, they must leave the place where they are. They live there. The government wants them to go to abroad, to leave Syria. They are where they live. Then I think that we're able to convey this very concrete approach. And also, as the last report of Human Rights Watch did, we call attention for the obligation of non-state armed actors to abide to international human rights law. And we have given several examples of gross human rights violations practices by those groups. I think that was for the first time because this was not much visible in terms of the analysis in Syria. Then this has had some developments in terms of accountability and in terms of the responsibility of individuals, but Akin would tell about that. I would just note that I read somewhere some analysts saying that there is a sort of paradox that at the same time that we affirm, as I will tell in a minute, we affirm that the only way out for the unrest in Syria is a negotiated settlement. That on at the same hand, we are indicating people capable of being investigated for crimes against responsibility. But this is what happens all over the world. This doesn't mean that because we are negotiating, we have to forget the human rights violations, the crimes against humanity. It's something that this is our job. The centrality of our job is the situation of the victims. And for them, we cannot just have a blind eye for these violations. And of course, there are other actors playing other different games in terms of the humanitarian access, the negotiation, and our role in terms of documenting, registering human rights abuse. Then, to conclude, some of the conclusions of the concluding observations of our report. First is that we think, for the sake of the rights of the victims, that militarization will contribute to escalate the present armed confrontation to a full-fledged civil war. And it will be much more difficult to negotiate in the format of a full-fledged civil war than now. Let's not be light about that. I think that's completely responsible to propose arms to the Free Syrian Armies or to the armed groups, because they just have light arms. Sometimes they have some sort of Kalashnikov, but they don't have weapons. Or to train those people, perhaps in 2014, there will be some progress. But this is, we think that this is not very responsible to play with these ideas of no-fly zone, humanitarian corridors protected by foreign armies without the consent of the Syrian government. And let's not play with that. Then we think that the most urgent target is a cessation of armed violence. I invite you to see that I'm not using the word ceasefire, because ceasefire when you have balanced armed force, and this doesn't exist in Syria. Then access to humanitarian assistance. Karen will deal with that. But it's completely wrong, the idea that in Syria there is an emptiness of humanitarian presence of the UN. This is a point that I have learned with Karen. Then we think that it's very important the release of arbitrarily detained people. We don't know how many people are in detention and where they are detained, because the ICRC was not able to reach an agreement. And the last thing, that we believe that only an inclusive dialogue with the government, all the currents of factions in the opposition. And it's not an easy thing, because as in every case in our transitions in South America, opposition is divided. People who stay inside the country and those who are abroad. That is, the opposition in Syria has no originality in this difficulty of consolidating a unified expression. And finally, that is, we in the conclusion have insisted in this inclusive dialogue. This cerise dans le gâteau, the last touch that I will give to this brief presentation is that all these points that are in our conclusions are the same language that is in the 6-point plan of Kofi Annan. And today we have the joy to recognize everything that we proposed in the presidential statement on the joint special envoy on Syria. That is the joy that I would like to leave to the end. I'm not saying that they have copied our report, but I want to say that we are very happy today. And everything that we have a positive step, we have to rejoice. Then we are rejoicing because of the existence of the statement, but we are rejoicing also because I think that we did a good job. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And where do you want to go now? Karen? Okay.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk a bit about the socioeconomic, the humanitarian, the refugees. We did think that we needed to include in the second report something about the socioeconomic situation in Syria more generally, not just what we thought that many people knew already, what was going on in the areas where there was fighting going on, the battlegrounds as it were, but also generally what's happening with the decline in the value of the Syrian pound, the rise in food prices, and how people throughout the country are suffering and with lack of fuel, water, electricity, and so on. That is one reason we speak about our opposition to sanctions, because we felt that these are something that do hurt the ordinary people and not are really affecting the regime elite that they're supposed to be targeted at. And that is the first thing. Excuse me, we know that the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs was given access to homes in Bab Amr. We know that first person in, short visit, but what's important is that there's a team in there from the Humanitarian Affairs Office that went along with the government mission with some trepidation, I would say, but also, as they've said, they put down their red lines on that. But we felt it very important, along also with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which has become a humanitarian player of late as well. So they're in there now, going to the various areas, Homs, Idlib, Dara, other areas, we hope, as many as they can, to begin to look at some of these issues. The other group that's in or about to go into are experts that are going in on behalf of the Joint Special Envoy of the UN and the League of Arab States. And we hope that these can be looking at some of the things Paulo has mentioned, but not all of them, that we didn't look at in great detail, but are certainly part of a humanitarian problem, and that's the internally displaced persons, maybe as many or maybe more as 200,000. The detainees, which may be around 18,000, which is the figure used, maybe more, maybe a lot more. And again, a group that hasn't been too much talked about, but these are the disappeared. And I just want to say that in interviewing the people who are outside the country, where we got all our information, this was, besides hearing about children and torture and so on, one of the most heartbreaking things was hearing from people who don't know where their relatives are, don't know if they're alive. And this is a group that we have no idea of the numbers in that respect. A week before last in Geneva, there was a humanitarian forum on Syria, chaired by Hoge, and again, with the presence of the OIC, also of the LAS, the League of Arab States, and UNHCR. And what was put forward there was one plan that originated from World Food Program, in fact, about prepositioning food for about 1.5 million people outside the country, $100 million cost, and so on. So at the same forum, there were reminders about, as Paulo has just mentioned, about the humanitarian actors already in Syria and who are carrying on with most of their activities, not inside, as again, the battlegrounds, but in the rest of the country, which is still about 2/3 of the country, with the exceptions of what's now beginning to happen in Damascus, rural Damascus, and so on. But you have in Syria, of course, the refugee problem, or the refugee situation, shall I say. You had 1 million Iraqi refugees passing through. Don't know how many of those are still left, but at least 110,000 of them are registered with UNHCR, being assisted and protected by UNHCR. You have 450,000 Palestine refugees being assisted and protected by UNRWA. And this is something that shows that there is ability to deliver, to serve these people. UNHCR has a plan for an extra 97,000 refugees to be fed starting this month, in fact. So you have many other agencies as well in there, besides the Red Crescent and ICRC, which have continued their work at great difficulty for some of them, with the head of the Syrian Red Cross having been killed, in fact, in his attempt to deliver some aid and see the situation. But UNICEF, World Food Program, UNFPA, UNDP, all of these agencies are there working in the country, outside, as I said, the battle zone. So this is something to keep in mind about the channels to receive and deliver aid. And also answers to why we don't believe there is a need for humanitarian corridors, buffer zones, and things that would have to be protected by a military when you have these civilian agencies that can carry on the work. The second refugee thing is the refugee outside, not the refugees inside. And that's in contrast to what happened earlier on in this conflict, when there were not very many refugees. It was quite puzzling to refugee agencies and refugee workers why there were so few refugees outside when the situation inside, as we knew it, was so horrific. We had refugees going out, for example, 20,000 to Turkey and 10,000 returning to Syria. That was an interesting thing as well. The refugees that were going out in some thousands, not many thousands, but a few thousands in Jordan, a few thousands in Lebanon. Many of them seem to be joining families, family members who were working in these countries where there are many, many thousands of Syrians in Jordan, Syrians in even more in Lebanon. So these now, what we see in the last couple of weeks is a larger flow of refugees. The 10,000 in Turkey have become 14,700. There are more thousands in both Jordan and Lebanon, as we understand. And the governments who've treated these refugees, or these people, as guests rather than refugees, concerned about their relationship with Syria and know what these people would mean with if they stayed in the country and so on, are now beginning to approach, or have been approaching UNHCR to help with assisting these refugees and to allow them to begin to register them. So there's a difference there as well. They're more like what we call the classic refugee, the classical definition of refugee, and what we assume is that they are people who may be now much more interested, going to stay in the country longer than people who are thinking of coming and going back to their fields or whatever as it suits them. These people who've lost everything, as we know, from the neighborhoods of Homs and Bab Amr and so on, they have nothing really to go back to. And so this is a different thing. We have our mandate continues till the end of this month, so we do have teams out already looking at the refugees in these places to have a look at the characteristics and anticipate the numbers that might be becoming increasing. So the message is to leave with you, or to discuss with you, is to watch this refugee flow, see what we can learn from these people now going out in greater numbers, to be sure that when we're making plans, we think about those agencies already inside who are able to help and, as I say, receive goods, deliver foods. They have mechanism and channels to do that. We know that the ICRC has proposed a 2-hour every day ceasefire, or quiet, zone of quiet, what words they're using there, to allow at least medical supplies and workers to go in and out, and that the Russians have agreed with the ICRC head that they will press the Syrians on that, so that we are hopeful that that will come through as well. And then, of course, it's the things that Paulo has already mentioned, that the dialogue, the internal negotiation, inclusive one, And that this is something that is very important because we know that there's so much of the country that remains on the side of the government, the minorities, as we know, the business communities, as we know. So whatever defections that are coming from them, beginning to come from them, there's still a large group of people who see their future better served with the government than with the opposition, which they don't know really what that's going to mean. So, and then it's of course, the presidential statement, which is again backing up one of our strong recommendations, is that the international community needs to come together, and that's another reason for our joy, as Paulo says, in seeing that this is maybe a first step in the international community working together, moving together, and making a difference in the lives of the Syrian people.
Thank you, Karen. Akin?
Yes. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank you for coming for this event, and we're looking forward to picking on your brains at the end. We're anxious to hear your views, your questions, and your comments. Much has already been described by my colleagues. I will focus on the issue of methodology and accountability. Of course, accountability or responsibility is the crust of our second report. Now, one might say to this commission, you haven't gone into the country. How do you feel confident that you have something to offer to the readers? Others may say, you know, the Syrian government enjoys considerable support. There are many indications of this, and you not having spoken to any of those people who support the regime, really being one-sided. And some of you are nodding, so I can see that it's in your minds as well. Well, first, let me say this, that Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights is by its nature victim-centered. So we don't have to talk to the supporters of the regime because we're not producing a political analysis, as important as that is, but it is a totally different thing. So given that our main task is victim-centered work, we reached the victims without being actually able to go to Syria. So in that sense, we feel quite confident that the evidence we produced in our two reports meets the requirements of this, the mandate of this commission. Of course, had we had access to the country, we would have been able to reach more enriched information. We would have hopefully been able to go to detention centers, actually have firsthand observation of issues of torture, etc. But what we have done, given that there was no access to the country, we have used every means possible, direct and indirect, to reach the information. All in all, this commission, in its beginning of its work since September, has interviewed 369 victims, witnesses, and defectors, as well as other individuals inside as well as outside who are known to be knowledgeable of the situation, including those who may have insider's view on the state, on the government side. So anything that is produced as a body of evidence in this report relies on first-hand testimonies. Where we did have to rely on secondary information, such as in the case of the government's discourse, because we wanted to present the government's perspective, we used government responses to our questions, which was very limited, but mainly documents that were available, and of course, Syrian state media and similar sources. So wherever such information was used, it was indicated in the report. And we also relied on secondary sources for developing the framework for the anti-government armed groups, because we had no access to their victims or the actual people who make up these groups, except for the top leadership or so-called leadership, who are generally placed in a defectors camp in southern Turkey. We did go and interview these people. There are, as Paulo said, the issue of leadership is very problematic because you have a few high-ranking officers, many of them are enlisted men, few high-ranking officers who are cut off from the field, cut off from the operations. They have merely a telephone and a laptop through which they can communicate. So the chain of command is very loose, if at all, there. But we did, in our second report, try to identify some of the more visible operations that have become known to by various sources of information. In developing our standard of proof of reliable evidence, we have used at least 2 witness accounts corroborated by other information and made sure that these witness accounts were reliable and consistent across the information collected by our investigators. So we did not use much of the information that was made available to us, which may have made the report more interesting, perhaps, more sensationalized, but we prefer to be on safe ground and talk about things that we can actually, with confidence, say that there is sufficient evidence. So in that sense, I think we as commissioners, we feel confident in what is claimed in the 2 reports. At the end of our first report, using international human rights law and international criminal law, we concluded that serious human rights violations, including crimes against humanity, have been committed pursuant to policy from the highest level with impunity. We did not apply international humanitarian law in this case because, as you all know, international humanitarian law is applied in cases of armed conflict, which basically has to satisfy 2 criteria, one of intensity of violence and second, level of organization. While we can easily say that level of violence has reached the necessary intensity, but in terms of level of organization of anti-government armed forces, as my colleagues have also already emphasized, we were not able to substantiate such a claim. So in our second report, we went beyond cataloging human rights violations, although we did update on the continuation and some new trends in the human rights violations since our first report. But the bulk of the report really focused on the issue of responsibility. As I said a little while ago, that our evidence indicated that these crimes and human rights violations were not sporadic and random and committed by those who were trigger-happy. They were trigger-happy, no doubt, but it was all taking place within the context of policy and directives coming from the top. And we have documented that the National Security Bureau of the Ba'ath Party, National Command, was used to translate this general body of policy and directives into strategic action plans, which were then used by the different army and security forces to implement the policies. So our report identifies specific individuals whose names came up consistently in many witness accounts as individuals who were directly responsible for the crimes committed. It also looks at command and superior responsibility to identify those who could have stopped, but knowingly have not stopped some of these atrocities. The report also has a fairly well analysis of the structure of the armed and security forces to identify army units, etc., where these responsibilities fall. So we have therefore deposited a confidential list of names, including units of the armed forces, security forces, and a database, our database, which has all the evidence which our two reports are based on. We deposited this list and the database with the High Commissioner's Office, which will be made available to competent authorities for reliable investigations to take place. So this list does not exist anywhere in electronic or hard copy except in that confidential, wherever it's being safely kept. And none of us have a copy of this list, obviously. And the High Commissioner does not have the prerogative to dispose of this list as she wishes. Oh, well, yes, she has no access to reading it, and she will not be able to turn it over to anyone who asks for it. So there are conditions which the Commission has outlined when we gave it to her safekeeping, that under certain conditions may this list be made available to aid future formal investigations. So we are still far away from that phase of formal investigations, because I think now the urgent matter is to get the violence to come to an end. And I will voice what my colleagues have already said. We feel the accomplishment this morning of the states coming together on an agreed language is a matter of hope, because one of the main issues that was keeping the stalemate as it is, a real bottleneck, is that the international community had divergent approaches. Some supporting the government, some supporting the opposition, but giving the message to both sides that keep on the business. You have something to rely on. Perhaps now with this decision, we may be able to achieve the first step to any form of transitional justice or reconciliation or accountability, and that is stopping the violence and getting the arms pulled out and relieving the civilian population. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Again, I'm going to go for questions in a second. I just want to continue a couple of points. On that very last point you made, is there anything in the language of today's presidential statement that actually gives you advantages you did not have before? For instance, I assume you're going to continue to seek entry to Syria. Anything in that statement that's going to make entry to Syria something easier?
Thank you. Well, of course, we welcome the statement because it's very much in line with our conclusions and our recommendations. We would have liked to see something referred to in that statement, that the government, urging the government to give access to this commission. It is not there. So directly speaking, no. But informally, I think once we've passed the phase of the continuing violence, a window of opportunity may be there where the government may wish to invite this commission, because at the moment, this commission within the formal structure is the only one that, of course, we very much appreciate the work of international human rights organizations who are doing remarkable work. But in terms of the UN monitoring, this is the only body that's doing it. And let's remember that even with all this work being done from the outside, whether us or international organizations, all of this is happening for the past year without any on-site monitoring, really, on human rights issues. And this is particularly a matter of concern and vulnerability. Thank you.
Paulo, I'm struck in all three of the comments by, I'm impressed by your insistence on having really credible, believable evidence before you make a charge. In that connection, did you ask the government to give you evidence of so-called foreign fighters, people coming in from the outside? And if you did, were they able to give you any evidence of it?
Thank you. As you have seen in the report, we are very cautious about that, because this sometimes is a great conspirational theory. But sometimes paranoids have real enemies, and probably they are. These fellow travelers, friendly combatants. We have asked many times, no, in different note verbal. That is our way of communication with the government. Note verbal that of course are always written, you know, and but the government has not shared with us this information. And of course, in our conversations with the representative of the government, we are always saying, but if you have any information that could about those terrorists that are operating, but even if the government has not shared with us information, some terrorist acts are happening, like the two last incidents, and I don't think that is realistic to say that the government is self-inflicting these things. And that is the danger. And that is why we are so happy today, because a lot of time was wasted in terms of reaching what is being proposed in this statement. Because this division among the international community, that some member states are protectors or considered as protectors of the government, others of the opposition. What is great today is that division, in a certain way, has been suspended today. And thanks, as Ms. Clinton said a few weeks ago, good old diplomacy. Let's not despair. Good old diplomacy is always useful. And in the case of Syria, there is no other way. There is no other way. That is, we are compelled to do what is being done by Kofi Annan and now by the Security Council. Let's not have fantasies that, and unhappily, a lot of people in many places of the opposition or sympathetic to opposition have this secret hope that perhaps this will happen. This will not happen. And I'll just quote something that I like. Perhaps I will adapt this to these guys. Is a sentence by former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates. I'll change what he said, saying any future member state who advised the international community to send a big land army in Asia or Middle East or Africa should have his head examined.
Two more things I wanted to ask you. One of them actually has two parts. One of the most disturbing aspects of the report is evidence you seem to have compiled of deliberate targeting of children and torture of children. I just want to ask you, you actually have hard and fast evidence of that? And can you go the next step and say, why would somebody do that? How is that a tactic of war? And the similar question about rape. Were you able to document cases where rape was being used as a tactic of war?
I'll take that. Well, the situation of children is a puzzling one. Over 500, 600 children are already recorded as having been killed. And the issues of, some of them, of course, have been killed while they were in their communities and their streets because of the indiscriminate bombing. But we have solid evidence of the cases that we talk about in the report of torture and serious abuses. I have spoken to one of the fathers in Jordan, one of the children that was tortured and killed. And he produced all the x-rays and doctor's reports and so forth. So if all the other claims are mere allegations, I know one child was severely tortured and killed at the end. But there are other cases which we have documented. So I won't dwell anymore. But this is interesting for us because within the Middle Eastern culture, there is a great deal of protectiveness over children. And how this kind of a strategic targeting of children became justified is unbelievable. I mean, we can speculate on reasons, but I won't go into all that. In terms of rape, in our first report, we did report on rape of men. And this was interesting because in all my experience in human rights work and as violence against women rapporteur, we always hear about rape of men, but it's always something that you can never document because it's far more sensitive than rape of women for some reason. But here we had actual testimonies of young men who were sexually abused. So we did report on that. Rape of women as a weapon of war, this did not come out. There have been many allegations, but we never made such claims in our reports because we had no testimony, that evidence that satisfied our methodological criteria, which doesn't mean it didn't happen, but we were not able to verify. But if there was a very systematic strategy of rape as a weapon of war, as we see in many other cases, I think few cases would have come our way. There may have been more isolated cases here and there, and I'm sure it must have happened because in such chaos, this is unavoidable. But we cannot say that there is a rape of women as a strategy of war.
The final thing I wanted to ask you about was arms. We know, because it's happening openly, the Russians are giving arms to Syria. There's an allegation that Iranians are giving arms to the regime. On the other side, I don't know who's furnishing arms to the rebels, but I wondered if that was part of your inquiry to document that sort of thing, and if it was, did you find evidence of large-scale arms smuggling?
Well, I need the mic. Sorry, that is, the Russian is delivering arms to Syria legally because there is not an arms embargo. There are reports or allegations that Iran is also delivering some support. That is, we don't have evidence on that. And but just as a comment, I don't think that the Iran is in a position to help too much Syria now materially, or if Syria needs this help. The other countries that are sending money and are furnishing arms to parts of the opposition. We were extremely cautious in the report. We didn't have sufficient evidence. We have anecdotal reports, but it's not a great secret that we know who are the states who are doing that. And I think that this is not very. I think that is not. That is, we don't have to criticize member states, but how I could put this diplomatically, I would say that this is not the most constructive approach to contribute to the solution of the Syrian crisis, proposing military intervention or training of the opposition in international conference. I don't think this is very helpful. But there are advisors inside the country, as in other previous unrests, and this is happening. The more time we waste not implementing the terms of this presidential statement, the presence of the elements will be bringing more tension and more difficulties for a good solution.
Excellent. If you'd raise your hands, I'll call on you, and we may take 2 or 3 at once to do it. Let's start with Craig, and then Hoge, and then here on the aisle. We'll take all 3, and then we'll answer them all at once.
I'd like to thank you for an extremely well-informed expose, but I'd also like to ask a question about your basic premise, which is that you're trying to assist a nonviolent transition. I mean, Karen's statistics were breathtaking. 8,000 dead, 18,000 detainees, 200,000 IDPs. These are not the numbers of a transition, but of a war. And it seems to me that it could be argued that your problem is not human rights in a transition, but rather human rights in wartime, which is a quite different set of problems. While you suggested it might take another couple of years of fighting to begin to change the balance, it would seem that that may be the only way to do so, because an immediate ceasefire, which would lead to the collapse of the regime, seems extremely unlikely. And simply continuing to call for one runs the risk of allowing the president of Syria to make a silence and call it peace, as his father did in Hama 30 years ago. And as it would seem, the son is determined to do as well.
Craig, would you identify yourself for the sake of the webcast?
Sorry, Craig Charney, Senior Advisor here at IPI.
Where was my second one? I've now lost track. Hoge, exactly, and then here on the aisle.
Hi, I'm Jose Vericat, an advisor here at IPI. One of the most vivid impressions of your recent report is the level of organization, centralization, and premeditation of the repression by the Syrian state. This appears to justify the argument that Syrian security forces were at least partially designed to suppress such rebellions. Would you agree? And if so, wouldn't it follow that the uprising, or the rebels, have really no chance without outside intervention? Thank you.
And here in the second row. I should have said, by the way, we are webcasting this, so when you hold the microphone, don't move it, because otherwise the sound won't go across. Thank you.
My name is Andrei Listov. I'm from the Russian mission to the UN. I actually have two questions. Madame Ertürk mentioned the case of a child. I think his name was Sharia or something like this in Jordan, yeah. And this case is reported in the first report. And there was also another case with Hamza al-Khatib, which is, quite known case. And as far as we know, Mr. Assad, the president, talked to his father, and the government presented absolutely different account from what your report said. So they established a commission to investigate this case. Do you have any information on follow-up of this commission and this contradiction between your account and the official version? Well, you reported that he had been detained in the airborne security base, and the government said that he was caught in crossfire. Well, what is the follow-up? My second question is about what you anticipate, what you expect of your of the renewal of your mandate. Will it stay the same, or is there any change anticipated? Might it be more focused on human rights violation on the part of the government? Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Shall we answer those in order?
Yes, I think I'll begin with the question of Greg. That is, we are so convinced about the negative consequence of militarization because we don't see any other issue. I don't want to seem futile, but there is a sentence by Marcel Duchamp. He says, there is no solution because there is no problem. There is no other solution. And this will not be the first time that negotiations will try to deal with regimes that are committing the kind of gross human rights. You know this better than I. You have Guatemala, you have Uganda, you have Burundi, East Timor, Kenya, Macedonia, and South Sudan, where you have atrocities being committed by these governments, and the possibility to end precisely with these massacres was negotiation, patient negotiation, and dialogue. Why? And my colleagues can elaborate more about that. If someone is confident enough to propose external military intervention in Syria, I think this scenario must take in consideration the price that the victims will pay will not, that is the graph that is today in the New York Times about the killings, will not be in hundreds or in thousands, it will be tens of thousands, as it happened recently in the very center of Europe. Then, of course, we are terribly affected. We are under the impact of the suffering of the victims. But in terms of finding a solution for these sufferings, let's be realistic. And I think that is the guys that are giving the most objective evaluations of the difficulties of military intervention is the Pentagon. Some of their when the U.S. government asked for option, and they said, with the anti-craft equipment that Syria has, it will be terribly difficult. All the possibilities are in terms of the geopolitical, in terms of geography. Then we don't work. We don't work with this possibility ever. We think that this will be a disaster, and I think that in the framework of our mandate, it's our obligation to think about the price that the victims will pay if such a scenario will be pursued. The questions about but I'll take just one about the future. Yeah. No, we had the opportunity also. We met very many times with your colleagues and in Geneva, and we are most thankful to all the dialogue that we since September we had with the Russian delegation in Geneva. That is, we didn't want to prepare something without knowing if this extension will happen, because this would be very pretentious to propose something that. Then that is, we have not yet discussed this, but I think that basically we'll continue to do the same thing. That is, with responsibility, with good evidence, continuing to documenting the human rights violations by the government or by the opposition. I think that we need to have this balance. But of course, perhaps we'll have the means to be a little more sophisticated in terms of locating, identify these violations in more concrete context, something that we are not able yet to do. But also, of course, there will be other developments in the area of humanitarian access that the report will need to take in consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
The colleague from IPI said, excuse me, rebels will have no chance without being armed. Yes, did I understand you right? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely right. If the objective is to let them fight it out. But we're hoping that it doesn't come to that.
My thrust of the question was the first part.
Yeah, Jose, wait for the microphone, please, just for the sake of the webcasting.
Yeah, my thrust of the question was the first part about the level of organization, centralization, premeditation of the state, of the Syrian state. Paragraphs 89 to 94, you give a very detailed description there of the way that things were organized, and whether that indicates that the Syrian forces were actually somehow designed for these, to deal with such a rebellions, insurgencies.
Well, you know, we are dealing with a very organized and well-functioning machinery. And I think that's what our report is saying, that there is no match between such an organized, strong military and security forces and very fragmented, unorganized, armed groups. So definitely there is a great deal of imbalance there. And the primary responsibility, therefore, falls on the state to stop the violence and pull its forces out of all populated areas. And this is what we're calling for. But let me turn to the question from our Russian colleague. We very much appreciate your government's position to be very firm on no outside intervention. And I think we appreciate this very much. But where we do not I think, see eye to eye is, but people are being killed at the moment. We must act as international community in unison to give the message that whatever the reasons are, etc., that we cannot allow this to continue. Let's stop the fighting and then support the Syrian people to reconcile their differences and build their society. That's where I think international community can be useful and supportive. In the paragraph 62 of our first report, we talk about the two children, Tamir al-Shari and Hamza al-Khatib. And I think the president talked about Hamza al-Khatib in his interview with Barbara Walters. But where is the evidence? The Syrian Commission of Inquiry, we are told, is doing investigation of all this, but we have not received results of this investigation. We have even requested from our Russian colleagues in Geneva if they have any access to such information that we can have it. So without any evidence, we are not in a position to say anything, to support what the government has claimed. Our evidence we are standing behind. Our evidence is sufficient to put it in writing. And if we are wrong, I think we need evidence.
Okay, I see three more. Ian Levine first, Jeffrey Laurenti second, and the gentleman in the second row third.
Thank you. Ian Levine from Human Rights Watch. Thank you to all the panelists for your work and for your presentations today. A comment and a question. In terms of the methodological issues which you talked about so interestingly, I just want to affirm much of what you've said. Human Rights Watch, like your team, has faced the challenge of documenting human rights violations on an extraordinary scale and of tremendous gravity from outside the country. And like you, we have been forced to find innovative ways of documenting those violations, from interviews with refugees, very difficult conversations via electronic means with people inside the country. I would mention the use of satellite imagery, which we have been able to use, for example, to document the extraordinary brutality of the bombardment of Homs. And anyone who wishes to confirm the extent to which indiscriminate violence was used in Homs who only has to look at the satellite imagery which we have on our website, which I think provides a very compelling case, together with victim testimony, of the scale of the violations. And I would just confirm that we have done independent research on deliberate violations against children, including torture and detention, and we would very much stand by those findings. In the light of the extent of the violations that you've documented, my question to you as a panel would be around the issue of accountability, which, Paulo, Sérgio, you said was central going forward. Will you, in your meetings here at the UN, be urging Security Council diplomats to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court? Thank you.
And Jeff.
Hi, Jeff Laurenti with the Century Foundation. I was struck by Karen's somewhat sanguine account of the humanitarian operations that are still functioning on the ground in Syria. UNHCR, presumably with the Iraqi refugees, and UNRWA perhaps with the Palestinian ones and whatever. To what extent do they have an ability to also provide, beyond their initial mandate, assistance to Syrians? Is anybody from outside providing assistance to Syrians themselves in these straitened times? And are their own programs actually now being tightened, being squeezed by dint of the overall situation there? That is, are we looking at an ever worse situation on the humanitarian side? If I may pose to Ms. Ertürk and Mr. Pinheiro, to what extent has the repressive apparatus gone beyond the security forces themselves, down at the local level, to the civilian faces of the party, the Ba'ath Party, teachers, and all that? How much is the civilian side of the government administration apparatus complicit now in the acts of severe repression that border on war crimes and atrocities?
Let me start by asking Karen to answer that direct question. We'll just go in reverse order.
Okay. Yes. I'm sorry if I seem to be sanguine about the needs of the Syrian people, and tried to indicate that I was talking about the Palestinians in the first instance, not the Palestinians, yes, and other refugees in the first instance, and that the assistance that they needed was more or less reaching them. Then that's why I started out with the socioeconomic situation as well, to show that the entire population is suffering. And I did not speak at all about what was really going on with, that's in our report, what's going on with the people who are there. The situation, the humanitarian situation generally, that's what we're saying, is deteriorating, and it will continue to get worse, particularly if there are sanctions that are there, and as the fighting spreads. So yes, there is more that needs to be done, but my main point was that there are channels, there are organizations that can provide this kind of aid before we think about extraordinary measures to go in.
Do you want to take other ones?
Ian, no, I'd like to thank Ian for the question, and we are very glad that what we have said in the reports coincide very much with much of the findings of Human Rights Watch. About the ICC, no. Perhaps the laconic answer is no. But that was not to be very polite, I will say. You know that we decided as a commission not to have a referral, to the ICC, because we think that this is not in our mandate. That is, we discussed this a lot, and we concluded that first, we haven't published the names because this will be a de facto indictment, and this will be completely irresponsible, unfair and irresponsible. In the case of the ICC, that is not being a criminal investigative body, not being a commission of inquiry, you know, this, for instance, in the last East Timor commission that I share, that we had a mandate to propose indictments, and this had. I'm glad that what we did had some consequence in terms of investigations and prosecutions. Our mandate does not refer to that. But on the other hand, the High Commission of Human Rights has many times has called for this referral, and I think that she has a mandate and the authority to do that. And in the conversations that we are having with several P5 members, and in the area formula that we'll have with the Security Council, we are very happy that we'll have this area formula. The other day, I met Ambassador Diego Aria. I was so proud to know the Aria formula concretely in front of me. But we'll not. We'll continue this in this position until now, at least. Now, just a previous footnote to what perhaps Akin will say. Let's not think that every member of the Ba'ath Party is a co-author of atrocities or responsible for human rights violations. Let's not repeat the same mistake in Iraq, considering all members of Ba'ath as a cheerleader of the atrocities. In Paraguay, every person that had to have a job in the government need to be a member of the Colorado Party. In many countries, in many authoritarian regimes, that's the rule. Then let's, that is, I'm not implying that you said this, but just as a cautionary tone, I say, let's not crucify indict the Ba'ath Party for everything that's happening in Syria. This will be a tremendous mistake. She will agree with me.
Well, I just want to add to what Paulo has already said on the ICC. I think we see ICC as a last resort. And that before we jump to that last resort, we must give a chance to other levels of justice and reconciliation and peace. Let us not forget that the objective is not only justice and accountability, but Syria has to, once all this violence is over, has to come to terms with its differences and rebuild its society. So peace is also very important. And analysts of conflict resolution and so forth, many of them argue that had there been an ICC when Northern Ireland negotiations were taking place, perhaps it would have been more difficult to reach the kind of settlement they have. I don't know. This is something that people write. But whatever it may be, that's very speculative. We believe that the responsibility for investigation lies with the state. Now, some of you may say, for heaven's sake, we're talking about a culture of impunity, killing machine, and how do you expect them to undertake such responsibility? This is precisely where the challenge is, and I think this is where the international community can play a positive role in helping, assisting Syria to develop its internal mechanisms and capacity by adopting the Rome Statute into its national legislation to enable it to investigate and prosecute these very serious crimes against humanity. Otherwise, it would be externally designed, unsustainable situation, which will, as we see in other examples, in recent examples, where the conflict will continue. So that much for ICC. But in a way, the international system still doesn't have those intermediate levels of enforcement which can be put to work. Coming to the question that you have, I think this is a very interesting question, and thank you for that. Although we don't have any hard evidence to say yes or no, but it's our opinion and my personal opinion that no, such repression hasn't gone to that level, and that's an advantage. We have heard opposition groups preventing people from going to school to obstruct, the normal functioning of society. But people have not started attacking one another, and I think that's such a wonderful advantage. And let's do something before people start hating one another and start killing one another. That will happen. We know from other conflict situations where people were not involved, but when it continues for so long and your brother is killed, your child is killed, you become enemies. At the moment, I don't think Syrian people are enemies. Thank you. Oh, I just want to go back to something quite prosaic that Ian mentioned. And if it wasn't clear from what Akin said earlier, we've also made great use of satellite imagery, using UNOSAT here and having a very good secondee from the Department of Peacekeeping Operations and a military expert, and providing the UNOSAT with what we wanted to see from the air at what times and where and so on. So we have investigators that spend hours poring over those images to back up our evidence.
Yes, I was intending to say that we have not yet our own satellite as George Clooney, but we are doing our best to use the elements that you have.
All right, we'll take another round. The gentleman in the second row, thank you for your patience, and then these two women here, second row and third row.
Thank you. My name is Nabil Munir. I am working with the Pakistan mission to the United Nations, and right in front. Thank you for a detailed analysis of what you've written already. I just have a question which Mr. Pinheiro, in fact, did allude to in his opening remarks as well. I just want you to dilate it a bit further on that, and that is on the kind of how do you reconcile the preparing and giving out a list of people to the Commissioner for Human Rights, and the fact that there is still a possibility of a negotiated settlement. This kind of a thing don't you think it would probably push the government and the people who are at the top to the wall, against the wall, and would probably make them all the more difficult to reconcile? I mean, I know this kind of list was prepared in the case of Kenya a couple of years ago, but that was done after the cessation of violence and hostilities. Just your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And this woman, and then right behind.
Hello, Naomi Weinberger from Columbia University. I would like to press you a bit on the issue of economic sanctions, particularly whether you take the position that all economic sanctions must be blunt instrument. Do you have no faith in the possibility of smart or targeted sanctions? And the reason I ask this is that while I'm inclined to agree that military means would make the situation worse, on the other hand, counting on diplomacy to work if the Assad regime does not feel any coercion may be naive. And the question is, what resources are at the disposal of the international community to make it painful for the regime not to comply, especially since if you look at what will be a long drawn-out struggle, and the majority of the Syrian population is living in extreme fear of expressing themselves, and civil society is so repressed. So it's not just the violent repression. What could turn this around? And the business community, for example, does respond to the economic circumstances.
And we just good to the woman behind you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Sheila Kim, human rights investigator, formerly with the UN mission in Sudan and South Sudan. So I'm very familiar with the difficulties regarding your qualitative and quantitative nature in your methodology. And this goes to maybe a two-pronged question regarding something you had said earlier that has been mentioned by other participants here about the lack of monitoring, perhaps your indication of needing a DPKO presence to stabilize, provide security, and also provide a mechanism of monitoring for not only international communities but other stakeholders. And going forward to, as you're nodding to an extension of your mandate, the report itself, because of the difficulties, and I'm very well aware as working with the situation in Southern Kordofan where you don't have access, with your report, are you hoping to maybe focus on more quantitative versus qualitative in terms of, on the policy level, pushing Syria to the point where it's irrefutable? The previous question is, how do you push politically a state to come to terms with the violations committed by their state actors, and if for compliance with international standards? Is that something that you're looking to as the Commission when you renew your mandate?
Thank you. Is it smart to make a list?
I am tempted to begin by the sanctions because I have several associations. There is an advertising by the Mandarin hotels, and they publish a photo of someone, and they said, she or he is a fan. I am not a fan of sanctions. I think that sanctions are not a strategy. Sanctions are an element of a strategy. When some member states, the most easiest thing to do is apply sanctions to several crises. I will not name any state, but there are some states that have this tendency to sanctions, for the mieux, sanctions. And as you know, sanctions do not work. I like very much.
I can't imagine who you're talking about.
I like very much the cartoon of Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, until President Bush and Fidel Castro becoming older and older, and the sanctions against Cuba. And a country that I was somewhat associated, Myanmar, Burma, there were until now, more or less, I think it's 25 years of sanctions. And the sanctions didn't help the transition in Burma. I followed this for 8 years. I will not elaborate on that. Then I think that I hope that my colleagues or Karen will say something about the sanctions. I think that the sanctions that are being applied on Syria are not being followed by, are not being accompanied by a follow-up of the real repercussions on the daily lives of the population. And this population that is submitted to collective punishment by the indiscriminate bombardment. I think that is too much to have to suffer the consequence of the sanctions. I'm not saying that every sanctions have this, but I think that at least let's stop the sanctions. Let's not create more sanctions to complicate more the situation. I think that perhaps the Brazilian International School of Diplomacy, we don't work with pressure, intransigence, sanctions. I think that there is the moment of dialogue, of patient, insistent dialogue. I think that's much better than sanctions. But this is a very impressionistic answer, but we are very convinced, all the Commission is very convinced, and we stated in our conclusion. The list, our friend from Pakistan, I think that we were very responsible, not publishing names. And it's very difficult to believe, but we don't have a copy of the list. I don't remember who is in the list. There is no hard copy, no electronic copy. The only hard copy is in the sealed, this two sealed envelopes that the High Commission has not read and will not read in the future. And we have not, second, we will not, as we answered to Ian, we not made a referral to the ICC. I think that we had, in terms of our mandate, a very prudent, cautious, and responsible behavior. I don't think that this is a threat. And as Akin said, I think that for the sake of the victims, we cannot renounce to the question of the accountability. But let's do first things first. And the first thing first is the suspension of the armed confrontation, the humanitarian aid, and the other points of the mission of we try to demonstrate this to the Syrian representatives, that what we are doing is it's something very cautious, and we are not at this very moment creating bigger problems for this. We are responsible players.
And yeah.
Well, if I understood your question correctly, I can only say that unless there is access to Syria for this commission, the commission's working method and methodology of producing its evidence cannot significantly change. We simply need to have access to the country to change those methodologies.
Go ahead.
Let me just say a couple of words about sanctions. We haven't made our point lightly, although it is our feeling and our consensus among us. We've just come from Washington. We've tried to explore somewhat with the experts on sanctions and the government to see what these smart sanctions are, targeted sanctions are, and so on. But right now, as Paulo said, what we see is the sanctions are mainly hurting the ordinary people. At this time, we certainly are against them. We're very much aware of the argument that if the sanctions would hurt the business community enough, that might be something that would really affect the regime, because they would lose that support. So we're aware of all those things, but our conclusion is that we are against those sanctions right now as this tactic, as we see it, rather than the strategy.
Paulo, Sérgio, Pinheiro, Akin, Ertürk, Karen, Koning, AbuZayd, thank you, first of all, for the excellent work you've done, and I think all of us wish you well in the continuation of that work. We all think, I know that this resolution in Geneva will go through and you will continue to exist until September. And secondly, I'd like to thank you in particular for bringing this meeting to IPI. We're very happy to have you here.